Hi everyone, welcome to Top 10 Middle Game Ideas number 10, When All Else Fails, or The Art of Doing Nothing. I wanted to start off by talking about where these ideas fit in the hierarchy of searching for middle game ideas. And the place you should start is with the usual suspects. Game plans that I've talked about here, like the Moroxi bind. If you're in one of those positions, you should have some standard moves in mind, or Spanish torture, Pillsbury attack, minority attack, those kind of things, pawn storms. You have some ideas in mind from your general knowledge of that position. Or maybe you're playing an opening that you're familiar with and you have some plans in mind. So you want to start with moves that fit in with that plan. And the reason why you start with these kind of top level ideas is it's all about efficiency. You know, if you had an unlimited amount of time, you could stop and consider every piece on the board and every square it could move to, and then choose the best move. And maybe that's what a computer does, perhaps. But chess is a game that's played in a fixed amount of time. Maybe there's an increment, but still there's going to be a limit to how much time you can spend on it. And also you get tired if you spend all your time thinking about every possible move. Your brain will get fatigued. So you're saving on time and efficiency in your calculations by going with standard plans. But a lot of times you will find yourself in a position that is either unfamiliar to you or it's new. I mean, you've gone through a plan and you've reached a position where none of these, any further plans don't seem to apply. None of your standard plans seem to apply. So there's a series of things you can look for at this position. I think looking for weaknesses is the next important thing to do. I wrote this from the point of view of your opponent's weaknesses. Well, if you have a forcing move and your opponent has to respond to it, then it's good. you can maybe avoid thinking about your own weaknesses. But loose pieces are weaknesses. Maybe there's a way to exploit that. If there's backwards pawns, maybe you can pile up on them. If there's a piece with limited amount of mobility, it's tied down either because there's not too many squares it can move to, or because it has a job to do. Maybe it's defending something. Then that is going to be a piece that's tied down, and maybe you can exploit that by attacking that piece. Also, looking at your own weaknesses and seeing if there's anything you can do. Is there anything your opponent can play to exploit your weaknesses, and maybe you want to prevent that. A general idea is you've run out of sort of active ideas. You can look at the placement of all your pieces and look at how effective each one is, and determine which piece is worst of your pieces and try and find a job for it to do. Try and improve your worst piece. And a last idea in the same vein, you can look at your opponent's pieces and see which piece is best. What's his strongest piece, and maybe you can arrange a way to exchange that off. But all of these are somewhat active plans, and sometimes none of these apply either. So there is a next level in this hierarchy. And that brings us to the topic of this video, which is what do you do when you can't find a plan at all? It's you're in a tough position, but sometimes there's just nothing active that you can do. And what you want to do is just wait and see what your opponent does, and maybe you'll make a mistake, and maybe you'll find some way to exploit that. Maybe it'll give you some new ideas after you see your opponent's move. So there's a hierarchy of moves you can play when you're looking for a move to play and can't find a good plan. Poking and prodding is a very common practice in this case. There's a pawn you can attack, see how he defends it. Go ahead and do that. You just poke at his position. Maybe you attack a piece, not that the piece is going to be taken, but maybe it's already defended, but maybe the threat of a trade will encourage your opponent to make a move. In addition to poking and prodding, or after poking and prodding, you can look for small strengthening moves. These usually have to do with the pawn structure, but sometimes with pieces too. If your pieces are not fully protected, moving a piece or a pawn to make sure everything is safe and protected, that can be considered a small strengthening move. Sometimes if you've got a piece or a pawn which is loose but not under fire, maybe you still want to move it ahead so it's not where it's defended, move it forward a square where it's defended by its neighboring pawns, and that it'll be a stronger pawn structure. Sometimes that's useful, although of course that often will open up lines, so you have to be careful with that. Or just a small pawn move on the edge to give the king a square to move to. That can be a small strengthening move, considered a strengthening move because it makes your king position a little bit safer. And then there's the art of doing absolutely nothing, or as little as possible. So if you want to do as little as possible, you actually don't want to move your pawns. You want to keep your pawns where they are. The thing about pawns moves is that they can't be taken back. So every time you move a pawn, you're making a irrevocable change to the position. So it's not really doing nothing. So what piece should you move, though? Often you want to look at pieces that move in a straight line, like a bishop or a rook or even a queen sometimes. Actually, queens work pretty well too for this. But the idea, let's start with the bishop. If you move a bishop along its diagonal, it still attacks all the squares on the diagonal that it was attacking before, along the diagonal that you're moving it along. And then in the perpendicular diagonal, there will be some squares that are no longer under surveillance by the bishop, and then there'll be some new squares that it attacks. So it doesn't do absolutely nothing, but you just carefully look at all of the squares that have been affected by that move, and also look at any lines that have opened up, and then that can tell you, is that likely to be a harmless move? And if it doesn't work out, or if you don't see anything, you can, after moving that, your opponent moves, you can always move the bishop back where it came from. And the same thing for a rook. You can slide the rook back and forth, and it'll still control all of those same files along that rank that it was sliding back and forth on. And then vertically, just look at the squares vertically where it was attacking, and then look at the new squares that it's attacking, and just observe the changes and observe any change due to the reposition of the rook to see if any lines have opened up because of that. So yes, just being careful about what squares are effective, and that will often allow you to make a move that does nothing. And the purpose of this move is really, you are just waiting, you're hoping that you'll get an idea, or that your opponent will make a move that will give you an idea, or maybe you'll make an outright blunder. So after each of these nothing moves, you really want to carefully check the position again, and go through that hierarchy and see if you can come up with a plan this time. Okay, that's it for this text section. Let's see if we can look at some games, find some examples. To find example games for this series, I looked through the games of Magnus Carlson. And I have to give Carlson credit. He played all kinds of positions. He played theoretical positions. He played non-theoretical positions. He played sharp tactical positions and slow positional positions. And in almost every position, he was always searching for something. So it was really hard to find a move that he made that didn't have some point to it, that was trying to accomplish some goal. So it wasn't an easy task to find games where he's got a move in it where he's doing almost nothing. But I did find a few. And these games, by the way, were all played at slow time controls. So remember, he's got time to think about it, and he's just run out of ideas, and he's just waiting to see what his opponent does. And you'll see that it can be a very effective strategy. But the other point I wanted to make is that because I've selected games where he's doing nothing, you shouldn't take these games as being typical of his style. I think he's got pretty much a universal style, and he can play all kinds of positions. Anyway, this first game I wanted to show you is between Magnus Carlson and Lavone Aronian. It was played in 2019 at the 6th Grinke Chess Classic. And Carlson with the white pieces starts off at d4. Aronian plays knight f6. I'm going to go through the game kind of quickly to get to the points that I want to highlight, but I do like to show this in the context of the whole game, and there are a few interesting points maybe I'll call out along the way. This turns into a Queen's Gambit declined by a different move order. And actually, it's still called a Queen's Gambit declined, I think, because in the normal move order, black first declines, waits for the knights to develop, and then takes. Anyway, this is a very standard position. Oops, wrong move. bishop g5 first, pinning the knight. c5, then bishop takes c4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop c3 check, and here we are. We're getting to the first kind of interesting position. This is the kind of position that's been seen many times before, and the queen is hitting the bishop, and the knight is hitting the pawn. So the most common move here, I think, is just bishop takes knight. There are other tricky moves you can play, like knight or bishop to b5 check and things like that. But Carlson plays a new move here, so this is a novelty on move 10. Brings the bishop back here, offering this pawn up as a sacrifice. Aronian declines. It's a bit risky to take this. The idea here is that the queen comes out, and if the knight continues to take here, the king is not going to take the knight, but instead the queen will come in and attack the rook. And we get a complicated position where, since Carlson was the one that sprung this surprise, I'm sure he has some ideas of what to play in this position, and Aronian decided not to go for that, but just very sensibly castled here. Okay, so queen e2 is played, then e5 kicking the knight. Knight goes to b3 kicking the queen, queen to c7, castles, and bishop to g4, poking at the queen. So f3 was played here, then rook to c8, so counterattack. Both bishops are under attack here. So this bishop goes to d5. Aronian trades it off. He's probably happy to get the bishop pair. And then this bishop retreats to h5. And then here Carlson comes up with another really nice move, which is c4. Just defending this pawn, and that pawn can't be taken. If the queen takes the pawn, then the idea is you put a rook here, and this rook is loose, and when white takes it, it's checkmate. So that's big problems. Even if, say, queen goes here, rook goes here, even if queen takes queen, it's followed by rook takes rook, checkmate, and the queen can't get back and defend that rook. So this just loses material if he takes there. Of course, Aronian sees that. He plays knight d7. Now his rook is defended, and that gives Carlson enough time to play rook f to c1. I think that's a good example of one of those small plans I was talking about at the beginning of this series. It's just a two-move sequence there, but you managed to get this pawn up here to a good square and get it defended before black can get organized to take it. Anyway, b6 was played here to keep the pawns from coming forward. a4. I mean, this was a small advantage to white, but it's no big deal. Things are still in the range of about even. Queen to... right here. Yeah, this is the point where Carlson is kind of... he's through with his preparation. He's played his middle game ideas, got a good position, but where do you go from here? He plays a series of kind of small moves, starting with queen f2. And, as I was talking about it, just shuffling your pieces along a line is often a good idea. Now, this did have some point. For one thing, that pawn was pinned, and now it isn't pinned anymore, so he doesn't have to worry so much about this pawn coming forward. I mean, it wasn't a worry with the queen here either, because the queen could just take. So this is a move that really does very little, but it did unpin this pawn. It does look at some squares here and here, so those are the differences, and it let go of the square here that it was looking at. But as I said, this pawn can't come forward, so that was a small move. Queen went to d6, blockading these pawns. Now bishop to e3 is another example of a piece moving along a line. This had a slight point to it. When this bishop moves out of the way, it actually increased the scope of the queen. So it did actually give white some additional options. But it's also a move that's doing very little. While the bishop was here, it was controlling all of these squares. And now the bishop is here, it's still controlling all of these squares, and it's controlling these, and it's no longer controlling these squares, but there's nothing really going on those squares that it gave up. So pretty close to a nothing move, but it did, well, we'll see. After bishop g6, the queen can now run to a different square, d2, where it was before. But the queen still is not doing a whole lot, going back and forth there to first to f2, then to d2. f6 was played here. It's an example of a small strengthening move, you might say. He's strengthening this e-pawn here. Although he did open up this diagonal, there's no light squared bishop for white to take advantage of it. So probably a nice solid move. And now queen to b2. So this is what attracted my attention to this game in terms of doing nothing. The queen went from here, and then it went from there to here, and then it went from there to here. So he's made 4 moves with that queen, and also 1 move with the bishop that just didn't do a whole lot. So rook to c7, knight to d2. Now things are happening. He's going to reposition this knight. This knight comes into c5, and the queen goes to a3. This is also a move that's doing something. It's kind of one of those moves you might think of as a poking and prodding move, but he's pinned that knight. That knight is, it's pinned against the queen, and he's got some pressure against it, so I wouldn't count that as a nothing move. And then Aronian plays rook to d8, which maybe is a slight weakness. There was a recommendation here that he should have played rook to, or queen to f8. But let's continue. Rook to c3, lifting the rook up and defending the bishop here, and preparing to double perhaps. So black played f5, and this move does definitely seem to be a mistake. And so that's, I would say, the culmination of this strategy of just kind of shuffling the pieces around. He didn't create, Carlson was very careful not to create any weaknesses of his own camp. And, when he did find something eventually to poke and prod at, which he did when he had the chance. But there were a lot of moves that did nothing at all. And then eventually Aronian had cracked under the pressure and made a weak move. And the weakness here is that this pawn is no longer defended. He had moved the f-pawn to f6, defending the center, but then he pushed it ahead. Maybe he's trying to do something active to refute Carlson's play, and but he created a weakness on e5. And actually, this pawn is very hard to save. So, for example, if this bishop comes back here, this was a suggestion from the computer. You can do some exchanges here. Take, rook takes, keeping the pawns together. Then rook to e3. So we see the value of lifting that rook is that it can double and attack this e-pawn. Rook to c7. Queen takes. That rook was kind of pinned there. Oh, I guess it wasn't really pinned. The rook came over to defend the queen, and that unpinned the rook. And then rook takes e5. And white has just won a pawn. Something similar happens in the game. Aronian just pushed on with e4. I just showed that line to show that this wasn't a bad move, this push to e4. It's just that he was losing the pawn anyway. And it may have been his plan to try and get some activity by pushing these pawns. But anyway, f takes e4, f takes e4, bishop takes c5, kind of similar to what we just saw. Rook takes c5. Bad. That was a misplay. There we go. Rook takes c5, and knight takes e4. He just grabs that pawn with the knight. And then after queen goes to e5, this rook comes over here, and we got the rooks doubled on the e-file. And so this knight is very securely supported, and the black has just lost a pawn at this point with no compensation. Now he's hitting the one point here is that if the rook takes the pawn, then knight can go to d2, and it's a fork. It's a kind of fork. It's a double attack. He's hitting the rook, and the rook is hitting the queen. So that can't be played, really. So that's another example of a small tactic being used to reinforce a position. So the rook has to move. It dropped back to c8. Then h3 was played here. The queen ran to c7. then the knight went around back to d2. So now this pawn, this pawn is securely defended here. Rook to e8 was played. It's supported by the bishop and the rook, so we can play that. And rook to e7, kind of a clever move, hitting the queen, forcing some exchanges and getting a rook active on the 7th rank. Queen to d8 was played. And then we're near the end here. Queen to e3, rook to c7, rook to e6, keeping the material on for now, but as soon as the bishop moves, there'll be a threat on the back rank. He went rook to c5. Carlson went queen to b3. Now he's triangulating on this pawn. So he's already a pawn up. He's about to gain another one, and Aronian resigned at this point. So that's the power of doing nothing, and a pretty good illustration, as well as a little bit of poking and prodding. Okay, I had another game I wanted to show you. The next game I wanted to show you was played at Norway Chess in 2020, and Alireza Firouzja had the white pieces, and Magnus Carlson had the black pieces. And both players were content to play a non-theoretical opening. We saw in the previous game actually a very sharp theoretical opening with a novelty from Carlson when he played Aronian. But here he's happy to play a non-theoretical opening, and his opponent was too. So let's just play a few moves here. Knight f3, knight f6, just getting the pieces out. c5, so kind of a English against a Reti attack. e5. So Carlson puts 2 pawns in the center. e4, d6, and it's already out of my opening book here. So, but both players are happy. They want to just get a new position on the board where both sides have chances. So this is actually similar to a Botvinnik setup, although this knight is in the wrong spot. It belongs on this square to be a true Botvinnik setup, but interesting to see him play it. d4 to break in the center right away. And bishop to g4. And the queens are, I was going to say the queens come off, but he didn't take right away. He played knight c3, bishop g7, h3, kicking the bishop. So there's this exchange. Then the queens come off. Then bishop takes. So Carlson didn't initiate the queen exchange. Alireza Firouzja started the queen exchange. And probably both sides are happy. Let's see, Carlson castles at this point. King comes up to g2. Knight to d4. I don't know, it's a pretty good looking knight. So white has the bishop pair, the pawn structure is symmetric, and black has a good knight. Bishop to g5, pinning the other knight. h6, kicking the bishop. And now we get into a even more symmetric position than it was before. Knight to d5. Almost everything is the same except for the position of the kings and the position of the rooks there. Funny. Okay, so rook to d6, rook a to c1, and bishop to d8. So this is where we get a series of moves from Magnus that seem to be doing nothing. I think, I'm not entirely sure. There may be stuff going on here I'm not seeing, but this is one of those moves. The bishop sliding along a diagonal. It's giving up defense of this pawn. Maybe it has things it can do on this side of the board. The knight is controlling a lot of squares that bishop could go to, so the bishop's scope is kind of limited here. It could be he's trying to tempt his opponent into bringing his rook down here. I'm not sure. Or maybe he's trying to keep control of this square. So I wasn't entirely sure that was a nothing move, but watch the bishop in the next few moves. So let's see, rook f to d1 was played, and king to g7. So I categorize this as a small strengthening move. The king steps up off the back rank, so if there's any exchanges on the back rank, they don't happen with check. And at the same time, it defends this pawn, so he's just a little bit stronger. Notice the king is on a dark square, while white has a light squared bishop, so it's just a little safer there. Let's see, knight to e3 was played, and rook to a6. This might be a nothing move, or you could think of this as a little bit of poking and prodding. I mean, there's a little bit of there's a loose pawn here, so you could classify this as poking and prodding. I was just thinking maybe it's a nothing move because white might have wanted to play that move anyway, but it did create a square for the knight to use potentially. So you could think of that as a little bit of poking and prodding. Anyway, h5, maybe another strengthening move, maybe taking squares away from the bishop. Knight to c4. Back up, knight to c4. So the knight's going to a different square. Oh, it's attacking this pawn. So what's that? Knight c4. Let's look at that. Bishop f6. Yeah, the bishop goes back. So the bishop has gone back and forth. h4, setting up a symmetric structure here. Rook to c8, going over to the c file. Knight to e3. Back. Rook a to c6. So not trading right away, but doubling the rooks on the c file, letting white trade. So rook takes, and rook to d3, and bishop to d8. So that's what got my attention about this game. The bishop started here, it went here, it went back, and now it's gone back. So it's just shuffled back and forth between these two squares. Bishop to d1 was played, so Firouzja is not above just copying Magnus. The rook drops back to c1. Oh no, the rook plunges into c1. Sorry, the rook runs ahead to c1. Bishop goes out to b3. Yeah, maybe it's targeting this pawn. b5 was played. Rook to d1, chasing the rook away, and the rook drops back to c8. So notice that Magnus avoided the trade there. There's a point to that, and I'll come to that in a bit. Let's see, this bishop went to a2. That's kind of a nothing move. a5. So that's not a nothing move. He's pushing pawns over on the queen side. Maybe he's trying to create some weaknesses here. The rook went to d3 and a4. So he's locked things up on the queen side. King went to f1. Bishop went to b6. So the bishop has moved for a third or fifth time, right? It went here, 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 and now it's gone here. And rook to c3. And rook to c3 seems to be a slight mistake. So notice how I said Magnus avoided the trade before, but here he's happy to trade. And I think this is an important point, that he doesn't trade needlessly or pointlessly, but when he can get an advantage, he will trade. And this weakens white's pawn structure here, this trade. So after b takes c3, and then knight to b3. So anyway, it was after a series of nothing moves that finally his opponent makes a move that weakens himself. So once again, that doing nothing strategy is paid off. Let's see, the king comes out to e1. Bishop goes to c5, targeting this pawn now. This is unprotected by its neighboring pawn, so the knight has to go back and defend. And then Carlson plays this idea with knight to c1. So the knight goes here. Bishop comes out to d5, and then the knight goes to d3 check. So he's actually winning a pawn here. The king comes to e2. Could be that Firouzja was low on time, and the knight grabs a pawn. And this we can play on a few more moves. What happened here? Bishop to c6, trying to recoup a pawn. f6, defending over here. Knight to e3. The knight goes to h1, so attacking this pawn. This knight drops back to f1 to defend, and now bishop takes a3. So there's just going to be some more exchanges of pawns here. And then this bishop went to b2. And the game continued for a long time, but Carlson stayed a pawn up and eventually won. Actually, after a long endgame here, Firouzja had gotten to a position which was a technical draw. He should have been able to draw it. So this this didn't necessarily, even though Carlson had an advantage, he didn't necessarily have to win this game, although he could press for a win as long as he liked, and it was just a blunder at the end that saved him. But I'll include a pointer to this game if you want to check it out, because see if you can spot the blunder and see if you can see if you would make that kind of mistake yourself, because I think it's a kind of it's a position that everyone should know. So go check it out and see if you know how to draw that position. Anyway, that's it for this video. I have one more video I'm going to do in this series. It'll be the last video. I have 2 more example games, and then I have just some final words on the middle game, and that will wrap up the Top 10 Middle Game Ideas series. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you then. Bye.